right. Welcome to our session today on vocabulary with an emphasis on students that are deaf or hard of hearing or have communication delays or disorders. I'm Christy Commander, deaf and hard of hearing consultant.
I'm Matt Hofdeiser. I'm a speech language pathologist.
And we'll begin with our land acknowledgement. The Creator gifted us with this land that we are blessed to share and care for together. The Calgary Catholic School District acknowledges that the land we are gathered on, Mokinsis, is the ancestral territory of the Sikasikapi, the Susika, Kainai, Piikani, and Amstaki Piikani. We acknowledge that all the Treaty 7 signatories, including the Tsuut'ina people, as well as the Eahari Nakota nations, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley. This land is also the home of Métis Nation Region 3, and all others who call this place home. We'll also have a prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Loving God, you have called us to do your work. Continue to fill us with grace and mercy, and feel empowered by your love and generosity. Support us in our efforts to do good for others. Direct our hands, hearts, and minds as we carry out our varied tasks, that we may be present to the world in the way that you are present. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're looking today at our board priority of student success. And within the student priority, we're looking at supporting diversity and student success. When we're looking at vocabulary, we're looking at a small but important piece of acquired words. Phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, comprehension, and fluency are also key components of literacy, but we'll be focusing on vocabulary today.
Okay, so just to start off with the basic definition, what is vocabulary? Vocabulary is the knowledge and use of words and their meanings. And vocabulary is really a fundamental part of communication. And here's a nice quote that I like from Eve Clark about vocabulary acquisition. Words are the starting point. Without words, children can't talk about people, places, or things, or about actions, relations, or states. So vocabulary or words are really the currency or the building blocks of communication, as we need to know individual words before we can start to combine them together to start expressing more complex information to other people. Vocabulary knowledge and use is essential to understanding others, to reading comprehension, and to expressing oneself. And a strong vocabulary is related to overall success in school and the ability to learn to read. And as it turns out, students who already have larger vocabularies tend to then learn more new words more easily. And there tends to be a gap between the vocabulary of children with hearing loss or language delay compared to their typically developing peers. So students with these delays are often delayed in their acquisition of vocabulary. They have smaller vocabularies. They acquire new vocabulary words at a slower rate. And they tend to have a smaller range of contexts in which they can learn new words. Pop on over to the next slide. Okay, so vocabulary develops through a combination of incidental learning on the left side here and explicit instruction. So incidental learning is what happens without direct teaching. So incidental learning happens by students engaging others in language, listening to adults read or speak to them, or for them reading on their own. So for typically developing students, most vocabulary knowledge is acquired incidentally through incidental learning through these daily interactions with adults, peers, and others. But for children who are at risk of reading disabilities, children who are deaf and hard of hearing, students with delayed language skills, and students with smaller initial vocabularies, well, these students are less likely than their peers with higher vocabularies to learn incidentally. So that's not to say it doesn't happen, but it happens less efficiently and it requires more repetition. So incidental learning happens for all of our students, but for our students with delays, we really need to focus our thoughts and our efforts on explicit instruction or explicitly teaching them about words and word meanings.
Got it. One of the necessary things to consider when addressing vocabulary is ensuring that the communicated message is being received by the learner. Learners with communication disabilities and the deaf and hard of hearing require speakers with a clear voice, a good volume, slower rate of speech, and a reduced background noise. Providing access to lip reading or oral cues can also help both groups of students. For the deaf and hard of hearing, use of their hearing aids, DM systems, or sound fields allow for access. Unfortunately, many of our deaf and hard of hearing students have spent a considerable amount of time without sufficient access due to late acquisition of hearing equipment, lack of batteries, and time for equipment repair.
So before we get into the explicit teaching, vocabulary teaching strategies, I just wanted to quickly touch base about how we can go about thinking about what words we can choose to teach. So our diverse learners are, of course, diverse in their vocabulary needs as well. There are some words that tend to be more difficult than others. So this tends to be verbs or action words. For a deaf and hard of hearing, it can be words that are unstressed or difficult to hear in conversation, like prepositions. Words that are longer, like 3 and 4 syllable words, can be harder to learn, and words that have multiple different meanings. Those are all words that tend to be more difficult to learn. And then we can go about choosing our target vocabulary words in terms of the 3 tiers, which you may have heard of before. So tier 1 words, it's on the right side here. Tier 1 words are words that are used in everyday conversation, and they're easily learned by children. They're simple words like baby, bird, fish, mommy, night. Tier 2 words are words that are common and they're used by mature language users, but they're found less frequently in conversation and more frequently in text. So these are words like concerned, dependent, survive. And then tier 3 words are very content-specific words that are not frequently used, and they're best learned for a very specific subject. These are words like nocturnal, amphibian, and habitat. So the general recommendation is that teachers in their vocabulary selection focus on tier 2 words because tier 1 words tend to be learned more easily in day-to-day conversation, and tier 3 words are so specific that they have limited functional value, whereas tier 2 words are frequent and they're useful across different domains. But with the caveat that children with language disorder and children who are hard of hearing or children who are ELL may need some more explicit instruction at that tier 1 range, since less implicit learning, as we discussed, tends to be happening. So for our diverse learners, we do tend to focus on these tier 2 words, but keeping in mind that we might need to be explicitly teaching some of these tier 1 words as well. All right, so in looking at the research for supporting vocabulary teaching for students who are hard of hearing, students with language impairment, and typically developing students, these are kind of the 5 themes that are pulled out of the literature. And we'll talk about each one at a time. I'll talk about kind of the theory or the ideas behind them, and then Christy will afterwards talk about some more applied classroom-based strategies. And for these tools, just keep in mind that depending on any single one, strategy all the time won't result in optimal learning, but it's really best to use a combination of these strategies, combination of these tools to help students develop their knowledge of word meanings. And of course, these tools are all going to look very different depending on the age level that you're working with, or the grade level, or the skill level. So applying these strategies for a grade 1 student will look very different than how you'd introduce them for a grade 6. All right, so we'll go through these 5 strategies one at a time. The first one we'll talk about is student-friendly definitions. That's a very important strategy for developing vocabulary. The research shows that students will learn more when definitions are explicitly given in the context you approach the word, but using student-friendly language. So this involves thinking about how a word is usually used in everyday language, the context it's being taught in, and then explaining that word using accessible, meaningful, everyday language to the student. A really good way to introduce definitions is through questioning and commenting as you come across new words. So for instance, if you're reading aloud and you come to a word that might be unfamiliar to students, or some of the students, you would explicitly stop, point out the word, and you could comment and say, what does that word mean? Does anyone know what this word means? And that's your opportunity to give a student-friendly definition or to gauge the student. Here's a nice little example of dictionary definitions versus student-friendly definitions. So it's really important when we give definitions that they're using student-friendly language, because dictionary definitions are often very complex, not very specific, and therefore not very helpful to our students. So here's one example of the dictionary definition of the word suggestion is the act of suggesting. So if we give our student that definition, they're not going to have any more information about what the word suggestion means, because they probably don't know what the word suggesting means. However, a student-friendly definition of the word suggestion would be what you tell someone that you think they should do, but in a nice way. So there's a few different examples of how we want to reframe dictionary definitions in more student-friendly language. And if you're having a hard time with it, there's even some child-friendly dictionaries online with that. Just Google child-friendly dictionary, and there's some that come with pictures and more student-friendly. All right, so our second strategy is repetition. Repetition is very important to learn any new skill or any new habit. It's especially important to learn new vocabulary. So even typically developing students require a lot of repetition of a word to learn that new word and its meaning, but our children with delays require even more repetition than their peers. And repetition doesn't just mean seeing a word over and over again, but it means seeing the word and being exposed to its meaning over and over again across many different contexts. So there's a ton of research that says the more frequently a student is exposed to a new word, the stronger their representation of that word will be, and the more easily they'll be able to use and recall that word. It's important to remember not to just bombard or repeat words across a single day, but to repeat words over time, and also allow for opportunities for space retrieval, which means that you're getting the student to actually retrieve the word themselves by asking them what that word is. What's that word again? And doing this over multiple different days. Our third strategy we'll talk about from the literature is using a multisensory or multi-contextual approach to teaching. So here we really want to focus on actively engaging with a new vocabulary word. In order to build word knowledge and word meaning, it's important to engage with new vocabulary in a variety of different ways. These are just some of the ways that are supported by research, and there's a lot of different ideas written here that'll really help students build the representation of word knowledge and the word in their head. So, for example, there's lots of research to say that just surely exposing the student to the written form of the word can help them remember more words and word meanings. So you could write down the word on the blackboard, or point it out in the book you're reading, or have the students write down the word themselves. When the students are more familiar with the word, you can have them make up their own sentence or explain their own definition of the word to you or to their peers. Using visuals is important for all students, especially for our students who are hard of hearing or who have language impairment. So how can we supplement vocabulary learning with a visual? Could we do a Google image search of that word? How about we draw a sketch or a diagram? There's a little example here on the left side of the word consider. This is what a sketch of consider might look like, or what a sketch of the word quest might look like. Is there 3D props or objects we can introduce? Or maybe if we're teaching at a younger level and we're doing a picture book, we simply point to a corresponding picture in the book. We can think about how students can really experiment with a word. Can they act out the word? Can they engage with the concept? This is especially helpful with, say, science concepts with different textures. Like if you're teaching the word smooth and bumpy, how can we engage with that concept? Let's go feel things that are smooth. Let's feel things that are bumpy. Get the student to look up the word themselves. You can find one of those student-friendly or child-friendly dictionaries online. And there's lots of research to say that even associating a gesture, even if it's just a made-up gesture, can help a student remember a word and the word meaning more easily. Of course, we want to use the auditory approach, so we will say the words to the student. We'll practice having the student say the word back to us, again, using spaced retrievals, so practicing retrieving that word over multiple different time frames. And then using memory. So what do we know the student knows? How can we link this new word to things that they already know? Those are all different ways that we can help students actively engage with new vocabulary words. Our fourth strategy from the literature is teaching students themselves to use word learning strategies. So an adult or a dictionary, of course, won't always be around whenever students are coming across new words, perhaps in text. So here we give the students tools or word detective strategies that they can use to figure out words. So word learning strategies usually focus on two areas. There's within word strategies. So here we would explicitly teach students about prefixes and what they mean, suffixes and what they mean, root words, root bases, and word families and what they mean. So that's looking within the word. And then we can also teach students to look outside of the word or use context clues. So this is teaching students to look for hints about the meaning of an unknown word in the words before that word, in the words after that word, and trying to build a best guess of the meaning of the word based on the information around it. So here's a quick little example. These are the 10 most common prefixes that will be encountered in the English language. So if we're using a within word strategy, for instance, we might teach our students that the prefix un, un, means not or opposite of, so that the students will know if they ever come across the prefix un at the beginning of a word, it means it's the opposite of the rest of that word. So for example, the word unhappy means not happy.
Okay. I've done this in Division 2 as a class and in small groups. Of course, it can be done with older students as well. They need to have some support and explanation to do it successfully. It can be done from text that you're reading or in isolation. So one of the ways I've done it is have students set up a loose leaf piece of paper, or you can give them a pre-completed one with word, prefix, root word, and suffix, and then have them break down words that you want them to figure out. And then afterwards, it's important to talk about how did they break it down and what would that root word be, and what are those meanings of prefix? What are the meanings of the prefix and the suffix? An additional way of doing it is to give the students possibly cards like this and having them or anything like that, and then have them do as many prefixes as they can, or sub-prefixes, or un-prefixes, or suffixes such as and. So just give them cards or give them examples of ones that you want them to do and come up with as many as they can. It takes about 5 minutes to come up with one, a bunch for a particular category, and the students can share it afterwards, and you can talk about what meanings might be based on words they've figured out.
So those are some nice examples of using within word learning strategies. And here's a little example of using a context clue. That's our second type of word learning strategy. I'll just read it out here. It's called the womb papa. So a lot of people do not like their womb papa. They don't like it because they don't like to be woken up in the morning. Many people keep their womb papa by their bed. I use my cell phone as my womb papa. So in using context clues, what we would do is teach the students to look at all the text around the word womb papa to figure out what they know or what they can gather about the word womb papa. So here we know that it wakes you up in the morning. They don't like it. You can use your cell phone as one. You can keep your womb papa by your bed. So of course we know that the word womb papa means an alarm clock because we gathered all of that information from the context clues around the word. And the last kind of vocabulary instruction strategy that I'll talk about is semantic mapping. There's a ton of research to support the use of semantic mapping for typical children as well as for children with language impairment. And semantic mapping, you might also know it as graphic organizers. It's a really broad category that can encompass a ton of different kinds of visuals. We'll show you a few examples of it today, just to inspire you with some ideas. And there's a few really big advantages to using semantic maps or graphic organizers for our students. And that's because they provide a visual display between concepts and key vocabulary. And of course, for our students with delays, visuals are very important. And even just the development of a visual often provides this kind of back and forth engagement for discussion and active thinking with our students. And then when we use these semantic maps, our students are incidentally exposed to many conceptually related words to the target word. And semantic mapping can really be a pick and choose of whatever you want to focus on. And there's so many different ideas written here. So your semantic map might include categories, functions, attributes, location, parts, descriptions, definitions, related words, synonyms, antonyms, multiple word meanings, the part of speech, the parts of the word, a sample sentence, a sketch, homophones, homographs, or what else is known about this word? What doesn't fit into any of those categories? Here's kind of a simpler idea for a semantic map or a semantic web for our earlier learning students who are focusing on learning noun to object words. So we can run through these different ideas or questions with the student about a vocabulary word that's a noun. Where does it belong? What's it used for? What group does it belong to? What parts does it have? What does it go with? What does it feel like? What does it look like? And what does it do? So there's another example of a semantic organizer. And then on the next slide, I believe we have a Venn diagram, which is yet another example of a graphic organizer. And of course, you're all familiar with Venn diagrams. We can use that for vocabulary learning in terms of comparing and contrasting what we know about vocabulary words. So this example is sea lions versus seals. We would brainstorm what we know is different or unique about each vocabulary item and put it on the outside. And we put the known similar parts on the inside, on the overlapping bubble of the Venn diagram.
This is another example of a semantic map that you might be familiar with using for synonyms. One like this might be brainstorming to reduce boring words in writing and to substitute them with more interesting or colorful or exact variations. Give sentence examples to show how it changes the meaning. You can have students stand up and dramatize how you would express these sentences into different words. And it really draws that understanding of meaning better. Looking at the literacy connections that you might have, you can use those as examples. And this particular book is excellent for these types of words. This is an example of PWIM, so that's picture word induction method. It can be easily used from the end of grade 1 and all the way up to grade 12. It can be used to produce sentences or paragraphs or for writing narrative stories. Teachers and EAs can support students with prompting with questions about their senses, WH questions, and have the students produce a greater number of words. So we're going to do this together. I want you to give you a try at it. So in the chat, write your words. Who, what, when, where, what do you see, what do you hear, what do you smell, what do you feel, what do you touch when you're looking at this picture? Your prompt is hot air balloon, and go ahead and chat.
Yeah, feel free to throw out some examples of words that come to mind when you see this picture.
Don't be shy, throw a word in the chat.
There we go, I see somebody's typing.
Thank you, Crystal.
Great.
Again.
Crystal wrote scary, comes to mind. Yellow, fire, blue. Thanks, Francesca. Smell, smell ozone from the storm, says Crystal. Oh, that's a good one. Karen says fire, stormy.
Excellent. Okay, so when we're looking at that, we might end up something like this. I like to do it with the picture rather than doing it in a web, because then you can actually draw connections from the picture to the actual word. For ease here and convenience, I've just done it this way. So we might have come up with some of these words, and obviously you guys came up with some great ones. That's how we would start with it. The next thing we can do is we call this a shakedown. We can take all of those words that you brainstormed and place them into categories. We can talk about those nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. We can talk about what do we see, what do we hear, what do we taste, what do we touch, what do we smell. If you've done any work with Barbara Mariconda, these ones are particularly helpful. Additionally, we can do the WH questions. When we're using this, we can brainstorm the vocabulary. We can have that for discussing new vocabulary in a unit. It can be used for establishing a shared vocabulary to make writing more successful for students with weak vocabulary. We can talk about the parts of speech, as out here, providing words for a common story setting. Oftentimes that makes it easier in your Div 2 class or Div 1 class even. What are we going to start with? Some of our students have such a hard time beginning story writing that even just having that little bit of extra background knowledge or accessing that sensory information really helps. It can also be establishing details for an expository piece of writing. Sorry, just got to click here. Something came up in front of my page. All right, so personal word books can be an excellent tool for vocabulary and spelling if used consistently and for all the students in the classroom. Also, posting, discussing, and referring to subject-specific vocabulary, word walls or posters helps link the concepts and words together. Repetition and use and frequently referencing them helps strengthen their understanding. Yes, if you're supporting students in the classroom and there are these helpful posters or word walls in the classroom, refer to them as, we want the students to be using them as a tool. We also have, we might use charts or smart art graphics in Word to help connect vocabulary words. We use something like this here. There's all different types of ways we can connect words. Explaining the difference between items, using vocabulary boxes if you want to test slight variations of words and whether or not they actually know them, or put exactly the words they might need on a test. That makes it easier for our students. They don't have to maybe have a difficulty time remembering, recalling the words. They just choose the words that's appropriate. Connect the words that they need to know with or for your students. For example, this one here, science words that students are using from grade 1 through 6 are all of these here. How are they connected? Well, they're connected with showing and explaining. Also using examples that are either concrete or visual will help explain some of those words. Additionally, using those visuals. So for deaf and hard of hearing students, this is a special note. The word learning strategy for using word families, etc. Those are really helpful. However, for our deaf and hard of hearing students, they might have a difficult time hearing the difference between them. The difference between bat and mat on the lips is hard to tell the difference. The difference between fat and sat can be really hard to hear the difference for. And just where they're made in the mouth and how we say them, what the students hear. So using those pictures or your own stick figures to support their learning, access to lip reading can also help, and this applies to spelling as well. Here's some graphic organizers. Matt showed earlier that using students, words that students already know is extremely important when defining the new words. They should not introduce an unknown language whenever possible. Use those associations, and your examples should be meaningful. Additionally, having them illustrate really supports some of these learning. Again, copying out dictionary words has limited effect unless the student can relate it to what they know. Here's just a few more graphic organizers that students can use to learn vocabulary. There's lots on EPD as well. When we're looking at things that we're doing in the classroom, like core reading, shared reading, guided reading, and independent reading, all of these can be beneficial ways to access and share new vocabulary with repetition, accessing background knowledge, practicing decoding, and then attending to word parts. Even when the students are doing independent reading, if the teachers focus them on what am I looking for, it's another way that we can get them to look at those words and develop more vocabulary. So even students in grade 1 and 2 use a little whiteboard, and you can find all of the words with the ing ending or ed ending, things like that. Okay. On top of that, we have providing unit definitions and highlighting new words helps to bring salience to recognition and as they're approached in the text. So as you're reading textbooks in the classroom, if you've already discussed the vocabulary, it makes it easier for the students to recognize them and hear them and go over them and remember them a little bit more. If students are tripping over their words as they read, it's often because they don't know the words or they're not in their current vocabulary. Providing correction and meaning for the words supports their learning. Modeling the use of think alouds and use of context gives students strategies for what they do when they're attempting unknown words. Retelling supports vocabulary learning because it's like rereading. It increases children's exposure to and use of new words and concepts in the story. Students often require support to learn how to retell stories. They can use a graphic organizer for that, or more tangible story sequence reminders such as the Brady. And if you want more information on that, it's also on EPD. When we're looking at writing, activities such as interactive writing, morning messages, guided writing, research writing, and journaling are all ways to draw attention to new vocabulary and use those picture prompts. So all of these, we talked about that poem, how we could use that, and all of these different ways help support that making sense. What is that word and what's the meaning? All of those things help support the understanding of more vocabulary. And did you know? So in our schools, we likely have these booklets. They have common affixes and graphic organizers listed in them. And you can also find a few of the assessments in the F&P box. So the ones for the synonyms, antonyms, and homophones, they are in them. These booklets are mostly available in elementary classrooms, but you might be able to find them if you're elementary, junior high. All right. And now we have time for questions. I'll ask you to unmute yourself, or you can write them in the chat. There are many references and useful websites at the end of this presentation. Please check them out. And also refer to EPD for our DHH and SLP strategies and resources. So begin you can open up the chat here or unmute yourself if you have any questions. We had a question earlier about what we can suggest for parents to use at home. And one of those things was using games such as headbands or Anomia or WizKids to help access those vocabulary words. Matt had a few other ones he was thinking of too, so you can share those.
Yeah, there's lots of different games, some commercials, some you can just play with your voice, like 20 questions. How about Pictionary? Lots of different games that can be used to target vocabulary at home in a more fun and natural way than sitting down with a dictionary or a book.
And headbands can actually be adjusted to use in the classroom for your vocabulary words. Things you can do. Any questions? Everybody's being shy. Well, there is a survey for you to complete. So if you can complete this survey for us, that would be awesome.
I threw a link in the chat there if you can complete the survey for us. Thank you.
Excellent.
A quiet bunch. You can also try copying it there, the HTTPS //bit.ly/DL sessions. Yeah. Works for me when I click on it. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks for the feedback. Appreciate it. There's lots of references and links at the end. I will stop the recording now in case anyone's waiting to say something because they're shy because the recording.